used every single persuasive tool at their disposal. So Yaz and I were exchanging emails about whether I could do this, and I said, Yaz, you know, I would love to. It sounds like it's going to be terrific. But the thing is, my husband is in Afghanistan this year, and I have 3 kids, and it's very hard for me to leave them for a night. And I'm quoting you now what Yaz wrote back to me. I can find it on my BlackBerry. He says, well, surely you can use duct tape and just tape them to the chairs for the night. I won't tell social services. And I just realized if Yaz was willing to recommend such fierce measures, I really had no choice but to come.
Canadians invented duct tape.
Okay, so there you go. So we are a tough people. I just want to say a few quick things before going into our panel. As I was listening to people speak earlier, especially about the power and really the responsibility of the Ukrainian Canadian community, I remembered the first year I lived in Ukraine, which was 1988-89. For that academic year, I was a student at the University of CUF. It was still the Soviet Union. And it was a very hard first couple of weeks because nobody would talk to me. Because I was a foreigner and it was considered to be risky, and so it was really, really lonely and scary. And then a student came up to me and she said, you know, we hear that you're not just Canadian, but you're also Ukrainian. And I said, yes, it's true. And she said, could you write down for us, please, the words of Shchenevnemo Ukraina? Because they wanted to know and they didn't, and that was banned. And that was the moment when I really understood the power of our community, of the people here, and the work they did before Ukraine became independent. And really that, you know, growing up Ukrainian Canadian, you kind of wondered, were your parents and your grandparents kind of crazy? Because for the rest of the world, it was the Soviet Union. Did Ukraine really exist? And did going to Ukrainian school and Ukrainian camp and all of that stuff, did it really make sense? And that was the moment when I realized that my grandparents were right, and that the Ukrainian Canadian community was such an important reservoir of the Ukrainian identity for Ukraine. And the hard work of transforming Ukraine, of course, has been done by Ukrainians, many of whom are in this room. But this is maybe another moment when it is the obligation of the Ukrainian Canadian community, living in a country which is democratic and free, to do some of the things that it's harder to do in Ukraine itself. And I think really that's why we're all here, and that's why I'm so grateful to the organizers for doing such a terrific job, and so excited about the conversation we're going to have. So, without further ado, can I please invite, I think we'll start before we all sit in our comfy talk show style chairs. We have one speaker who has pride of place, because he is a leader of our country, Canada, and he'll speak from the podium. This is the Honourable Peter Van Loan. He's the Leader of the Government in the House of Commons, and I can't resist saying that in addition to having occupied many cabinet positions, being a member of Parliament, he shares something with the Ukrainian Canadians here because he's Estonian. So he knows what it's like to be part of an effective diaspora community, and I'm really looking forward to hearing his remarks.
Thank you very much, Christia, and good evening, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to address you tonight. I'm delighted to be here. The last time I was on a panel that Christia chaired was actually out at the Vancouver Olympics. It was a pretty exciting time, a group of international investors we were dealing with, and it was almost as warm outside then as it is today. I bring greetings from my colleague, Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs, John Baird, who unfortunately is out of the country, not able to join us here tonight, but did want his greetings sent. Now, as you all know, Ukrainians have deep roots in this country, beginning with the first waves of Ukrainian settlers in the late 1800s and continuing through the last century. And Ukrainians, of course, at the time came to Canada in pursuit of freedom and opportunity. They traveled across a vast ocean in the hope that, given the chance to rely on their own work ethic, energy, and ambition, they could build a life for themselves and their family in this new land. And Ukrainians have indeed succeeded and have helped to build our country. That original wave of pioneers who broke the land in Canada's west and helped populate this vast country, however, was followed by other Ukrainians. What came later were Ukrainians for whom the challenge of freedom and survival was not merely a question of subsistence, but actually one of existence. They had survived and escaped the terror of Lenin and Stalin's Soviet Empire, from the genocide of the Holodomor, to the horrors of the Gulag, and of course the random terror of the NKVD. To those refugees, Canada's freedom and opportunity was not just economic, but also political. The experience of the fragility of freedom, that it can be so easily crushed by authoritarian tyrants, has informed the attitude of Ukrainian Canadians to their country as well as to their ancestral homeland, and it's driven their political engagement. In fact, in the caucus of the governing Conservative Party of Canada, there are many for whom similar formative experiences have driven us to become politically active. I have colleagues whose roots lie in places like Poland and Romania, and of course, there must seem a couple of dozen, including my own parliamentary secretary and many who are here tonight, who have Ukrainian roots. And as Christia pointed out, my own roots are Estonian, and I was raised on a steady diet of stories of near-death experiences at the hands of successive Soviet, Nazi, and Soviet occupations. And I learned early that democracy is fragile and freedom is easily lost. And it is what drove my interest and involvement in politics. It's the reason I am here today. Not surprisingly, those of us who share that background have chosen to belong to a party and a government that does reflect our values and has put those values at the center of our foreign policy. Those values, freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law are the four cornerstones of Canada's values-based foreign policy. And that focus is evident in our response to recent events in Ukraine. Canada feels a real stake in the success of a modern, free, and independent Ukraine. Indeed, it was Brian Mulroney's Conservative government that was the first to recognize Ukraine's independence at the collapse of the Soviet Union, and Canada has remained steadfast in support of the Ukrainian people. And the years following independence, Ukraine made great strides in rebuilding and emerging after 70 years of Soviet tyranny. The Ukrainian people turned their back on their communist past and embraced their hard-won liberty along with the spirit of democracy and freedom, respect for human rights, and an established rule of law. But Ukraine has also remained a critical battleground, an echo, if you will, of the Cold War, as a fading empire seeks to resist the loss of what it considers to be its cultural birthplace. A notable example has been the aspiration of many in the Ukraine to find a home in NATO. Vladimir Putin has attempted to draw a line, saying that Russia would not accept NATO accession for the Ukraine. And in fact, even telling President Bush in a discussion of that the Ukraine was not even a nation. Wisely, the West, notwithstanding the unhelpful advice of people like Jimmy Carter, did not give in to identical threats from the Soviets over German reunification or similar Russian threats over Baltic NATO accession. Prime Minister Harper has made clear Canada's position. No country can have a veto over Ukraine's alliances. NATO accession is the decision for the people of the Ukraine. The tug of war in Ukraine became one of the most dramatic skirmishes in the battle for democracy promotion and the spread of the values in which we all believe. The 2004 Orange Revolution, as you know, was of course a bright moment in the building of democratic principles. The Ukrainian people stood up to the old-style muscular theft of elections and were able to, in a free and fair way, ensure the democratic alternative prevailed. Sadly, however, as we all know, the Orange Revolution fell victim to some of the weaknesses of a young democracy that had not really matured. To adopt a phrase I'm fond of from our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, in the early years of Confederation, the gristle had not yet hardened into bone. And recent events in Ukraine have demonstrated how easy it is for democratic development to start rolling back. This fall, we had a debate here in Ottawa in the House of Commons on the ongoing erosion of democracy in Ukraine, and in particular the politically motivated and arbitrary prosecution of former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko. In the debate, I highlighted the bitter disappointment of the recent developments since President Yanukovych came to power in 2010. Since those elections, we have seen an administration that appears to be prepared to subvert justice and the rule of law for the pursuit of political ends and to eliminate rivals. In every international rating of freedom, Ukraine is sliding. In the press, you have journalists who practice self-censorship to avoid persecution. It is worth also questioning how free and independent a press can be when the largest media magnates also just happen, a media magnate actually just happens to be the head of Ukraine Security Service. And of course, the Ukrainian government's actions since the Tymoshenko trial have not shown signs of improvement. Just a couple of weeks ago, we saw another apparently politically motivated arbitrary conviction of former Interior Minister Yuri Lutsenko. Last month, I can tell you that as part of our engagement on Ukraine, Canada's interventions paved the way for 3 Canadian doctors to conduct an independent and medical assessment of Ms. Tymoshenko. Ms. Tymoshenko's health and treatment should remain our primary focus of all involved, but the Tymoshenko and Lutsenko situations represent a troubling trend. So perhaps it is fitting that the theme of the conference you're all participating in tonight and tomorrow is Ukraine at the Crossroads. With elections later this year, Ukraine really is at a crossroads. We've seen this past week in Russia, the jailing of political opponents, the stifling of the freedom of press, carousel voting, in fact, a third of all voting stations experiencing irregularities according to the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. Vladimir Putin took careful note of the Orange Revolution. He was determined it was not a model he wanted exported to Russia, and now his anti-Orange Revolution playbook is being exported to Ukraine. For those of us who care about the promotion of democracy, we must confess that these setbacks represent a real challenge to our objectives. And we must acknowledge that the tools of democracy promotion, as we were practicing them just 8 years ago, are now not sufficient to the task at hand. In fact, we in Canada, though, have other things we have at our disposal to assist. With the large Ukrainian community in which many of you are leaders, we have the ability to support Ukrainian people, to reach out to them and support their efforts. In fact, I believe it is people-to-people ties that we can use to make the most effective difference. That has certainly been the case in the past. And those ties are perhaps our best vehicle to encourage Ukraine on the path to mature democracy. To tell you, when I was Minister of International Trade in 2010, I was pleased to announce the start of official negotiations with Ukraine towards a free trade agreement. Progress towards a free trade agreement has not been as rapid under the current regime, and perhaps not as rapid as we certainly would have hoped it would be, and certainly not as rapid as it was under the previous administration. But we will continue to move carefully forward in a fashion that will enhance freedom and economic opportunity for people in both countries. At the end of the day, strengthening ties and building engagement remain critical, we believe. Another thing we know is that in the Orange Revolution, young Ukrainians were at the forefront, and young Ukrainians continue to be a key to determining the future of their country. Canada is seeking to support this in many ways, including through the Canadian-Ukrainian Parliamentary Program, where young Ukrainians come here and get to learn how the system works, how democracy works, and the value of our rule of law. And of course, our youth mobility programs offer opportunities for people to come to Canada, build those ties, and appreciate what it means to be in a stable, modern democracy. And of course, we have other programs and ties as well. But we are committed, of course, to supporting the ongoing efforts for democratic development in Ukraine. This was demonstrated by Prime Minister Stephen Harper when he accepted the Shevchenko Award from the Ukrainian Canadian Congress last year. And at that time he said, Canada will support Ukraine whenever it moves towards freedom, democracy, and justice. For millions in Europe, the collapse of communism has led to freedom and prosperity they dreamt of for generations. The Warsaw Pact countries like Poland, East Germany, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and more have stepped into the mainstream of Europe. And as the voice of a new Europe, they become key players in objecting a firm, democratic, and freedoms-oriented posture into the European worldview. The emancipated former republics like the Baltics have become champions of freedom. Yet a few remain on the fault lines: Belarus, Moldova, and of course Ukraine, notably. In those countries, we have not yet seen the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama would have had it. Why the difference? What will it take to cross that gap? How can we see a true free democracy take root deeply in those troubled places? Your work at this conference should be with that goal in mind, and that should continue, not just tomorrow, but in the weeks and months to come. Thank you.